In the flight of shadows and honor, what starts as a tense flight for Douglas Carter and his teenage son, Kyle, quickly shifts into an unexpected journey of transformation. When they meet Major Marcus Hayes, an unassuming yet commanding passenger, hidden biases come to light. But when crisis strikes mid-air, Marcus's quiet courage forces Douglas to question everything he once believed. Can a single moment change a lifetime of perspectives? Can a father's realization forge a deeper bond with his son? Join us as we explore this powerful story of humility, heroism, and the strength to change. If you're intrigued, give this video a like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge. Now, let's dive into The Flight of Shadows and Honor. The morning air at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was thick with the blend of anticipation and tension that only the start of a journey could produce. Travelers, some hurried and some weary, bustled between terminals, their footsteps merging with the voice of the PA system, announcing departures and last calls. The steady roar of jet engines outside the glass panes hinted at countless stories in motion. Business ventures, family reunions, new beginnings. Douglas Carter navigated through the crowds with practiced precision, his tailored Navy suit sharp against the chaos. At 52, Douglas was the epitome of a man whose life had gone according to plan. Successful career, firm handshake, and an air that suggested he had the answers before the questions were asked. Beside him, his teenage son Kyle trudged along, earbuds buried deep in his ears, and an expression that straddled indifference and quiet rebellion. "Keep up, Kyle," Douglas said without looking back. His voice carried the clipped tone of authority, one that had shaped boardrooms and commanded respect, or at least submission. Kyle sighed, his gaze flickering over the faces they passed. The airport was a microcosm of the world outside, filled with hurried parents shepherding children, business travelers tapping away at laptops, and people with weary eyes clutching passports and dreams. A small smile tugged at the corner of Kyle's mouth as he caught sight of a family sharing a bag of popcorn, their laughter piercing the din with its warmth. They reached the gate, where the seating area was already a mosaic of travelers settled in for the wait. Douglas's eyes swept over the crowd with the practiced aloofness of someone searching for the familiar. His gaze stopped when he saw the man who would become an unwelcome presence in his journey. Seated with an air of quiet confidence, Marcus Hayes glanced up from his tablet. The tall, broad-shouldered African-American man wore a charcoal blazer over a simple white shirt, blending elegance with practicality. His posture was relaxed but alert, eyes that held stories flickering with a soft, intelligent light. Beside him, an older woman leaned in to say something, and Marcus responded with a smile that creased the corners of his eyes. Douglas's jaw tensed. His upbringing, a blend of inherited beliefs and the unchallenged status quo, whispered reminders he didn't question. His chest tightened with an inexplicable discomfort that made his world seem a touch smaller. Kyle's attention drifted back to his father. He noticed the slight narrowing of Douglas's eyes and followed his gaze. The teen's expression shifted from mild curiosity to embarrassment as he sensed what lay beneath his father's stare. "Dad, don't," Kyle whispered, voice low and pleading. Douglas ignored him. The gate attendant called their boarding group, and the surge of movement nudged Kyle forward, away from the gaze of Marcus, who had caught the exchange and raised an eyebrow, unreadable but steady. The cabin of the Boeing 777 had the sterile, hopeful gleam of a space designed for people going somewhere important. Douglas settled into his first-class seat, the leather cool against his back. Kyle slumped into the seat beside him, flipping through the in-flight magazine without seeing the pages. The soft shuffle of passengers finding their places filled the air, punctuated by the beeps and clicks of overhead bins being closed. Just as Douglas was preparing to lose himself in the reassuring glow of his tablet, Marcus appeared in the aisle, moving with the grace of someone accustomed to navigating confined spaces. He slid into the seat across from Douglas, his presence commanding attention without effort. The moment stretched, taut and uncomfortable. Douglas could feel the irritation growing inside him, familiar and sour. "I'm going to speak to the attendant," he said abruptly, unclipping his seatbelt. Kyle's eyes widened, his mouth opening in protest, but Douglas was already flagging down Claire, the flight attendant, who approached with a polite smile. "Is everything all right, sir?" Claire's practiced tone held just enough warmth to soften any complaint. "Yes, I'd like to request that he be moved to economy," Douglas said, tilting his head towards Marcus. His voice dropped to a low conspiratorial pitch, but it carried far enough. "It's just, you understand." The muscles in Claire's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. Marcus, now aware of the exchange, turned his gaze fully on Douglas. For a moment, silence fell between them, charged with a current that cut through the noise of boarding announcements and conversations. "I'm sorry, sir," Claire responded, choosing her words carefully, "but all seats are occupied, and there are no available spaces to make a change." Marcus said nothing, but there was something in his expression, a restrained patience, a practiced response to a world that often tried to shrink him, that spoke volumes. Douglas shifted uncomfortably under that gaze, a part of him recognizing that he was outmatched in a confrontation that had never needed to happen. Kyle looked between his father and Marcus, the embarrassment now a hot, stifling weight in his chest. He sunk lower into his seat, wishing the flight had never begun. The plane began to fill with the murmur of settling passengers, punctuated by the mechanical whine of engines winding up outside. Claire finished securing the last overhead compartment, her eyes momentarily catching Marcus's. A fleeting glance passed between them, a silent exchange that spoke of mutual understanding. Then she moved on to help others. Marcus leaned back, eyes shifting to the view outside, where the vast expanse of the runway glistened in the morning light. He was aware of Douglas's discomfort and the furtive looks from others, but he remained focused, his posture steady. He had been in this position before, being the quiet center of unwanted attention, and had learned that responding with grace often spoke louder than confrontation. Kyle turned his head slightly, stealing a glance at Marcus. There was something calm, almost unshakable in the way Marcus held himself. For a moment, Kyle's curiosity overtook the embarrassment and confusion. He wanted to say something, maybe even apologize on behalf of his father, but the knot in his stomach kept him silent. The boarding completed, the flight crew prepared for takeoff, running through the routine announcements. Douglas shifted in his seat, already regretting making the request. It had been a reflex, a conditioned response that now felt heavy and ill-timed under the scrutiny of his son and the watchful eyes of the passengers who had heard him. He adjusted the cuffs of his sleeves, trying to push down the uneasy prickle running up his spine. As the plane began its taxi down the runway, a charged silence settled between Douglas and Kyle. The roar of the engines climbed, a vibration that buzzed through the seats as the aircraft gained speed. Kyle gripped the armrest, his pulse picking up with the rise in momentum. The world outside blurred until the plane lifted, leaving the ground with a smooth ascent. Next to him, Marcus's expression remained composed, eyes closed as if he were somewhere far away, detached from the reality of first-class cabins and whispered judgments. Kyle noticed how Marcus's breathing stayed even, his hands relaxed on the armrests. It was a stark contrast to his father's rigid posture. "Seatbelt sign is off, ladies and gentlemen. You are now free to move about the cabin," came the smooth voice of the captain. The tension in the cabin lifted, people unbuckling their seatbelts with audible clicks and shifting to more comfortable positions. "Are you okay?" Kyle asked, surprising himself with the question. It was quiet enough that only Marcus heard him. His father, lost in emails on his tablet, didn't notice. Marcus opened his eyes, giving Kyle a small, kind smile. "I'm good, thank you." "You?" Kyle nodded quickly, his face flushing as he turned back to the window. A simple interaction, but it was enough to shift something inside him. Hours passed, the plane gliding steadily above the clouds. The cabin settled into a rhythm of quiet conversations, the shuffle of pages turning, and the faint hum of in-flight entertainment. Douglas checked his watch and shifted in his seat, impatiently awaiting the moment he could lose himself in the scheduled business calls that awaited him in London. But the silence Kyle had maintained since takeoff was starting to gnaw at him. Marcus pulled a well-worn paperback from the seat pocket, the pages creased and yellowed at the edges. It was an old copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. He turned the pages absently, eyes scanning familiar words. The practice of Stoicism had always offered him comfort, reminding him to focus on what he could control and let go of what he couldn't. He read the passage. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. A soft chime announced the service cart making its way down the aisle. Claire approached with the practiced smile of someone who had diffused tension in countless flights. She glanced between Douglas and Marcus, a slight hesitation in her eyes as she addressed Marcus first. Would you like something to drink, sir? Water, please, Marcus replied, his voice smooth and polite. Kyle shifted in his seat. When Claire turned to him, he asked for orange juice, and for a moment their eyes met, sharing an understanding unspoken. Douglas, catching the small exchange, felt the stirrings of an unfamiliar emotion, something more complex than annoyance. He took a deep breath, rationalizing it away. The flight continued, each second chipping away at the boundaries that had been set long before the boarding call. The cabin had settled into the steady hum of mid-flight, a pocket of time where most passengers began to find their rhythm, either drifting to sleep or engrossed in their entertainment. Douglas couldn't relax. Every so often, his eyes darted toward Marcus, who remained composed, flipping the pages of his book or leaning back with his eyes closed. The irritation Douglas felt was becoming an itch under his skin, one he couldn't shake. Kyle, sensing his father's tension, braced himself for what might come next. It was moments like these, moments when silence held a warning, that Kyle knew to stay quiet, avoid eye contact, and hope the tension would pass. But today, that hope seemed thin. A soft laugh from across the aisle drew Douglas's attention. It was Eleanor Green, an elderly woman with a crown of silvery curls and eyes that missed nothing. She was sharing a light conversation with Marcus, who leaned in respectfully to catch her words. Eleanor's voice rose just enough for others nearby to hear. Your stories always sound so unbelievable, Major Hayes, she said, eyes twinkling with admiration. Oh, I assure you, most are more mundane than they seem, Marcus replied, his smile warm. The word major hung in the air like a revelation. A few heads turned, curious murmurs rippling through the cabin. Kyle's eyes widened as he pieced together what others seemed to already know, that Marcus was not just a calm, well-dressed passenger, but someone who carried the weight of service and leadership. Douglas shifted in his seat, discomfort morphing into something closer to defensiveness. Major Hayes, is it? He muttered, more to himself than anyone else. It was loud enough for Kyle to hear, though, and the boy's heart sank a little further. Kyle couldn't help but feel a wave of embarrassment for his father. The realization that Marcus was someone significant, a military officer who likely deserved far more respect than he'd been given, tightened the knot in his stomach. He stole another glance at Marcus, now engrossed in conversation with Eleanor. She hung on his every word as if he were recounting a tale from an adventure novel. Kyle's mind raced back to a history lesson he'd had a few months earlier. It was about resilience and the contributions of soldiers from diverse backgrounds, often overlooked in favor of more familiar stories. He wondered what Marcus's story was and if it mirrored any of those lessons. Douglas leaned closer, his voice low but stern. You're fidgeting, Kyle. Sit still. Kyle's mouth twitched, words pushing against the barrier of his silence. But they didn't come. Instead, he nodded, shifting slightly in his seat as he picked at a loose thread on his jeans. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and loaded. Marcus was aware of the conversations, the subtle shifts in the atmosphere that followed the mention of his rank. He'd been through this before, watched the mix of respect, curiosity, and discomfort that came with recognition. It was a strange thing, carrying a title that could inspire admiration in one moment and mistrust in another. He glanced at Kyle, noticing the boy's averted eyes and tense shoulders. Marcus's experience told him that not all conflicts were obvious, and not all battles were fought with words or actions. Sometimes they were fought in silences like this one. From his seat, Douglas became increasingly aware that others in the cabin were paying attention. They exchanged looks that spoke of curiosity. Who was this man across the aisle, and why had Douglas acted as he did? He felt exposed, as if the walls of the cabin had shrunk. Eleanor, noting the change in the air, patted Marcus's arm and lowered her voice. "You always manage to turn a simple flight into an adventure, don't you?" she joked, trying to dispel some of the tension. Marcus chuckled lightly, eyes crinkling with genuine humor. "I try my best, Mrs. Green." The human warmth between them was palpable, a small beacon that contrasted with Douglas's simmering discomfort. Claire passed by, meeting Marcus's eyes briefly and offering a small smile. A silent acknowledgement of his patience and the weight of the moment. Kyle glanced at his father, catching the tight line of his mouth and the slight twitch in his jaw. It was the look Douglas wore when he was trying to assert control over a situation he could feel slipping away. Kyle's own anxiety bubbled up, but so did something else, a spark of quiet defiance. He turned his head toward Marcus and spoke, his voice breaking the brittle silence. "So you're a major? Like in the army?" Marcus's eyes softened as he nodded. "Yes, in the army. Did a few tours, both abroad and at home." Kyle's interest lit up his face, a look Douglas noticed and frowned at. "Wow," Kyle said, words tumbling out before he could second-guess them. "Did you do peace missions too, or just, combat?" Marcus's expression shifted, a mix of pride and something more somber. "Both? Sometimes helping means stepping in where it's hard. Sometimes it's lending a hand where it's needed most, even if that means putting down the armor." The conversation between them hung suspended, watched by nearby passengers who feigned distraction but listened intently. It was a small moment, but to Kyle, it felt like the beginning of something much larger. Douglas sat back, his jaw tight, as the realization sank in. The walls he had built, unquestioned for so long, were starting to show their cracks. The hum of the engines thrummed through the cabin, a steady background that seemed to amplify the strained quiet between Douglas and his son. Across the aisle, Marcus returned to his book, but his focus was elsewhere. He could sense the complex tangle of emotions unraveling around him: curiosity, admiration, discomfort, and a lingering thread of tension. Claire passed by with the beverage cart, pausing at Douglas's row. "Can I offer you anything, sir?" she asked, her tone professionally neutral, but her gaze searching for any sign of further trouble. "A bourbon. Neat," Douglas replied curtly, needing the burn of alcohol to steady himself. He glanced at Marcus as Claire poured the drink, catching the slight nod Marcus offered her in silent thanks for her service. Kyle shifted in his seat, his eyes flitting between the drink in his father's hand and Marcus's calm, composed posture. The teenager's face was a map of mixed feelings, guilt, admiration, and a creeping awareness of how different this flight would be from any other they'd taken. Eleanor Green, ever observant, leaned toward Marcus again, this time with a touch of seriousness in her voice. "Major Hayes, I read about that mission in the Middle East, the one where you coordinated the medical response. They called it a miracle, didn't they?" A murmur moved through the nearby passengers. Marcus's eyes flicked to the left, catching sight of a couple in the row ahead, leaning closer to listen. He responded with a modest smile, an echo of memories sparking behind his eyes. "It was a team effort," Marcus said, his voice even but edged with a deeper emotion. "We were just there to do what needed to be done." Douglas shifted uncomfortably, his grip on the small glass tightening. The more people listened, the more isolated he felt, as if a spotlight were exposing him for what he was, someone who had misjudged and let his bias lead him. Kyle's curiosity burned brighter. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then finally asked, "What happened there?" Marcus paused, the cabin shrinking into a bubble of shared attention. His eyes met Kyle's, and he could see the earnestness there, the hunger for something true, something that could anchor a moment and shape it into meaning. "We were in a conflict zone where basic needs like food and medicine were in short supply," Marcus began, his tone quiet but commanding. The hardest part wasn't facing danger. It was watching people suffer and feeling the weight of every decision we made. We managed to get supplies in and set up a medical camp. The local communities did the rest. They were the real heroes. Kyle nodded slowly, his admiration growing. He leaned back, but his eyes lingered on Marcus, and for the first time in hours, he felt a strange sense of hope. The conversation around Marcus sparked more side glances, more whispers. Douglas felt them as if they were aimed directly at him. He wanted to dismiss it all, rationalize his earlier actions as a misunderstanding or an overreaction. But the truth sat heavy in his chest. "Can I talk to you?" Douglas said suddenly, his voice directed at Marcus. The question was so unexpected that even Kyle stiffened, eyes wide as he turned to his father. Marcus looked up, his brow lifting in mild surprise before he nodded. "Of course," Marcus replied, closing his book and leaning forward slightly. There was a pause, a breath held by those close enough to hear. Douglas shifted, unsure where to begin. The words he chose were awkward, rough-edged. "I didn't know who you were." Marcus's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened with understanding. "I'm just a passenger on this flight like you," he said, his voice neutral. "But you're not, are you?" Douglas's voice cracked at the edges. The revelation of Marcus's rank and his work hung between them, a testament to the vast chasm between perception and reality. "I'm someone who believes in doing what's right," Marcus replied simply, his gaze holding steady. No more, no less. The simplicity of the statement stung. Douglas had spent years building his world on complexities, negotiations, and unspoken rules. But here was a man who spoke with clarity, who acted with conviction. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Kyle's eyes flicked between the two men, absorbing every word, every shift in expression. For the first time, he saw his father not as an immovable figure of authority, but as someone struggling with the weight of his own beliefs. The conversation ended as quickly as it began, but its echoes remained, vibrating through the cabin like the steady thrum of the engines. Marcus returned to his book, though he barely glanced at the pages. Eleanor patted his arm, offering a small nod of encouragement that only he noticed. Douglas sipped his bourbon, the warmth of it doing little to thaw the cold realization creeping through him. Kyle turned back to the window, the cloudscape below no longer just a blur, but something vast and uncertain, like the questions now filling his mind. As the minutes ticked by, Claire approached again, this time with a quieter, more personal touch. She glanced at Marcus and then at Douglas, sensing the shift that had occurred. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of concern. Marcus met her eyes and nodded. "Yes, everything's fine," he said, a small smile easing the tension in the air. Claire's shoulders relaxed, and she moved on, leaving behind a space that felt just a little less charged. Douglas exhaled slowly, setting down his glass. He caught Kyle's eye and saw something he hadn't before. Disappointment mixed with hope. It was as if Kyle was waiting, willing him to take the next step, to let this moment change more than just the flight. The cabin settled into the rhythm of the long flight, the subtle shifts of passengers seeking comfort in their seats, and the flickering glow of screens casting a soft light over their faces. Douglas sat rigidly, his mind a whirlpool of thoughts he hadn't confronted in years. The sting of Marcus's calm defiance lingered, needling at the edges of his pride and the long-held beliefs that shaped it. Flashbacks crept in, unbidden but powerful. Douglas saw himself as a boy, not much older than Kyle, running through the large yard of his childhood home. His father's voice, deep and authoritative, echoed in his memory. "You stick to your own, Dougie. The world's better that way." The words had been a command, not a lesson, rooted in the traditions of an era where division was worn like a shield. He remembered the gatherings, large, pristine, and exclusive. The Carter family prided itself on upholding certain values, values that Douglas had carried into his adulthood without question. Until now. Beside him, Kyle shifted, pulling Douglas out of the past. The teenager's face was turned toward the window, but Douglas could see the tension in his profile. It reminded him of how he had felt at Kyle's age. Conflicted, aware that the world outside was changing, but unsure what that meant for the world inside their home. The silence between father and son had stretched long enough that it felt almost impenetrable. But Kyle, emboldened by the small exchange he'd had with Marcus earlier, dared to break it. "Dad," he said quietly, glancing sideways, "why did you want him moved?" The question was a knife, sharp and unexpected. Douglas's initial response was to deflect, to insist that it wasn't worth discussing. But the look in Kyle's eyes stopped him. Open, searching, almost pleading. This wasn't the time for old habits. I thought it would be more comfortable for everyone," Douglas said. But even as the words left his mouth, they sounded hollow. Kyle's silence was its own rebuke, leaving Douglas staring into the chasm between what he said and what he felt. Across the aisle, Marcus's thoughts wandered, stirred by Kyle's question. It brought back his own teenage years, growing up in a small town where he was one of the few faces that didn't blend in. He remembered the way he learned to stand straighter, speak carefully, and work twice as hard just to be seen as equal. He recalled his mother's voice, calm and steady, as she told him stories of resilience. "You don't have to prove your worth to anyone but yourself, Marcus. But when you do, make it count." Her words had carried him through West Point, through grueling training, and into missions that tested every ounce of that hard-earned resilience. Yet, even with his medals and accolades, moments like this flight reminded him of the silent battles still fought every day. Eleanor, now resting her head against the seat, whispered softly, "You're doing better than you know, Major." Marcus looked at her, surprise flickering across his face before it softened into gratitude. "Thank you," he replied, his voice low but resonant with meaning. The plane soared above an ocean of clouds, a vast expanse that seemed peaceful, almost serene. But within the cabin, tension simmered. Claire made her rounds, her eyes darting between passengers to ensure calm. She noticed Kyle's downturned face, the lines of worry on Douglas's brow, and Marcus's steady, unbothered presence. It was as if the air crackled with an unspoken charge. Kyle finally turned back to Marcus, who had resumed reading. His question came out before he could second-guess it. "What made you join the Army?" The question earned a glance from Douglas, his expression unreadable but attentive. Marcus lowered his book, studying Kyle's earnest face. The question had been asked before, many times, but there was something different when it came from someone searching for more than just an answer. "I wanted to be part of something that protected people, that stood for something bigger than any one person," Marcus said. "But I learned that sometimes the greatest battles are the ones you don't see, the ones fought for understanding, for being seen beyond what people expect." The response left a silence that was heavy but reflective. Marcus looked over at Douglas for a moment, not with accusation, but with a gaze that saw past the facade to the man wrestling with his own thoughts. Douglas's hand curled around the armrest, knuckles whitening. For the first time, he felt the stirrings of understanding. Uncomfortable, jagged, but unmistakable. The conversation was reshaping something inside him, prying apart the beliefs that had solidified over decades. He wanted to speak, to ask Marcus about the stories he'd read in the papers, about what it meant to serve and sacrifice without thanks. But the words sat like stones in his throat. The cabin lights dimmed as the crew prepared for the mid-flight rest period. Passengers adjusted their seats, the noise level dropping to whispers and the rustle of blankets. Kyle glanced at his father, hoping for a sign that this moment was sinking in. And for the first time in years, he thought he saw it. A flicker of uncertainty in Douglas's usually resolute expression. The cabin lights dimmed, casting everything in muted hues of blue and silver. Outside, the sky had deepened into a dark ocean, punctuated by stars. Douglas leaned back in his seat, the weight of Kyle's question pressing down on him. The silence between them now felt like an accusation, stretching across years and memories. Kyle let out a soft sigh, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the armrest. He stole a glance at his father, searching for some sign of acknowledgement, but Douglas's gaze was distant. focused somewhere beyond the seatback screen, displaying an unimportant movie. Kyle's frustration simmered beneath the surface, but so did something else, an unfamiliar empathy. His father's discomfort was palpable, and though Kyle couldn't excuse it, he was beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, change could still happen. Marcus's eyes remained closed, but he was alert. Years of training had honed his ability to rest while remaining aware of his surroundings. He could feel the cabin's collective tension, hear the whispered conversations, and the small shifts of passengers adjusting their positions. Even in this suspended moment, thousands of feet above solid ground, he recognized that the greatest movements were happening quietly within the minds and hearts of those around him. Douglas's mind drifted again, unbidden, to memories he had tucked away behind years of ambition and certainty. He saw his father sitting in the leather chair by the fireplace, a glass of scotch in one hand, the other pointing to a newspaper headline. It was a story about change, about civil rights marches that made Douglas's father's face tighten with displeasure. "Remember, Doug," his father had said, voice like gravel, "the world out there is chaos. We stick with what we know, with who we are." Douglas had nodded back then, young and eager to please, not questioning the narrow lens through which he was taught to see the world. But now, as he glanced at Marcus, that once clear vision blurred with doubt. He had never imagined sitting across from a man who so easily challenged those inherited beliefs simply by being who he was, respected, composed, and quietly defiant in the face of prejudice. Kyle noticed his father's introspective look, the lines on his face deeper than usual. For the first time, Douglas seemed small, more human than the figure who set rules and expectations that felt impossible to meet. The soft click of a seatbelt unfastening drew Douglas's attention. Marcus stood up, stretching before making his way down the aisle. The movement brought curious glances from passengers, some of whom had begun to piece together who he was, connecting his name with newspaper articles and stories that spoke of heroism under pressure. Kyle's eyes followed Marcus, admiration sparking in them. He looked at his father again, gauging his reaction. To his surprise, Douglas's expression was contemplative rather than dismissive. Kyle opened his mouth, hesitating, but then pushed forward. "Dad, did you ever think about serving in the military?" Douglas's eyes flicked to his son, startled by the question. He took a moment, considering an answer that was more than a reflex. "No," he said, the word heavier than he expected. "My father didn't think it was worth the risk, not when there were businesses to run and legacies to maintain." "But do you think he was wrong?" Kyle pressed, his voice low but insistent. Douglas looked away, the cabin's dim light casting long shadows across his face. The truth hovered on the edge of his tongue, restrained by pride and fear. "I don't know," he finally admitted, the confession quiet but seismic. It was the first time he had let uncertainty slip through the polished armor he wore so tightly. Marcus returned, nodding politely to Claire as she maneuvered down the aisle with her service cart. He caught sight of Kyle's questioning gaze and Douglas's expression, no longer hard and dismissive, but caught in a rare moment of vulnerability. "Everything all right?" Marcus asked, the question gentle, not intrusive. Kyle nodded quickly, but Douglas's answer was slower. "Yes," he said, eyes meeting Marcus's for a fleeting moment. "Thank you." It wasn't just a courtesy, it was a reluctant acknowledgement, a step toward something different. The silence that followed was not heavy, but expectant, as if the cabin itself were holding its breath. Marcus nodded, taking his seat again, and the moments rolled on, unnoticed by most, but significant to the few who felt the subtle shift in the air. Claire paused near the galley, watching the interactions unfold. Years of working flights had taught her to read people, to sense when conflicts brewed or when something shifted. Today's flight had an energy that kept her on edge, but it was also a reminder of why she loved her job. It wasn't just about getting passengers from one place to another, it was about being a witness to stories, big and small. As she turned to tend to an elderly passenger's request for water, she thought about the subtle ways in which people changed. It wasn't always grand gestures or loud confrontations. Sometimes it was a quiet question from a son or a hesitant glance from a father. Sometimes it was a silent nod from a man who carried his dignity like a shield. She smiled softly, moving down the aisle, the weight of the moment settling into a corner of her mind that held the stories she would never forget. The plane cruised smoothly through the night sky, the hum of the engines lulling many passengers into a light sleep. The soft glow of reading lights punctuated the dimness, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously intimate and vast. Douglas sat with his eyes closed, but he wasn't asleep. The conversation with Kyle and the presence of Marcus had unsettled him in a way that was difficult to ignore. Suddenly, the seatbelt sign pinged on, accompanied by the captain's voice, calm yet firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are approaching an area of mild turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." A collective murmur rolled through the cabin as passengers shifted, settling back into their seats. Kyle glanced at Douglas, searching for reassurance, but his father's eyes remained fixed ahead, unreadable. Across the aisle, Marcus's hand rested lightly on the armrest, his posture unchanged, embodying a calm that belied the growing tension in the air. The plane shuddered once, a warning tremor, then steadied. Claire moved quickly, ensuring all passengers were secured, her trained eyes scanning the cabin for any signs of panic. The tremor passed, leaving behind a silence that seemed deeper than before. Douglas exhaled slowly, the tightness in his chest easing. He glanced sideways at Marcus, who was staring ahead, his expression contemplative. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Douglas felt something shift, a realization that the man across from him was neither a threat nor an anomaly, but simply human. Kyle noticed the exchange and felt his pulse quicken. It was as if an invisible bridge had been laid between his father and Marcus, fragile but real. The moment gave him the courage to speak again. "Dad," Kyle whispered, his voice trembling but determined. "Did you know that Major Hayes, Marcus, worked on peace missions? He saved people. A lot of people." Douglas's jaw tensed, the weight of Kyle's words pressing against the barrier he had spent years constructing. His eyes flickered with something that might have been regret or curiosity. He didn't respond, but the silence that followed was charged, hinting that the question was sinking deeper than Kyle knew. Without warning, the plane jolted violently, pulling gasps and murmurs from passengers. The overhead lights flickered as the cabin tilted for a moment before righting itself. Claire's voice came over the intercom, steady and professional. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are experiencing unexpected turbulence." The shudder of the plane seemed to amplify the tension. Douglas's heart raced as he instinctively reached for Kyle's hand, gripping it tighter than he realized. Kyle's eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and surprise, turned to his father, and for the first time in years, they shared a moment of vulnerability. Marcus's eyes scanned the cabin, noting Claire's quick, reassuring gestures as she moved from one row to the next. He stayed composed, his training making him a calm center in the chaos. It was in moments like these that instinct and presence mattered most. He glanced at Kyle, offering a brief grounding nod that said, "It's going to be okay." As the turbulence subsided, a new tension arose. A middle-aged man 2 rows back called out, his voice panicked. "Help! My wife! She's not responding." The words sliced through the cabin, pulling Claire's attention instantly. Claire rushed down the aisle, her voice controlled but urgent. "Can you tell me what happened?" The man, his face pale, stammered an explanation. His wife, a woman with graying hair and a soft face, was slumped against the window, eyes closed, her breathing shallow. Passengers watched, eyes wide and breaths held. Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt, his calm demeanor shifting into action. He stood up, stepping carefully into the aisle, and addressed Claire. "I have medical training. Let me help." Claire nodded, relief softening the tension in her face. "Please do, Major." Douglas's chest tightened as he watched Marcus move with precision and confidence. Marcus checked the woman's pulse and airway, speaking to Claire in clipped, efficient tones. "We need oxygen and the medical kit." Kyle's eyes never left Marcus, awe dawning as he saw the man's composure. It was clear this was not new to Marcus. He was in his element, a guardian in unexpected circumstances. As Marcus worked, Douglas felt a strange blend of emotions twist inside him. He couldn't ignore the stark contrast between himself and the man now helping to save a life, a man he had dismissed out of prejudice only hours before. The realization was bitter, and it gnawed at him with a quiet ferocity. The cabin held its collective breath as Marcus administered oxygen, checking the woman's response. Seconds passed like hours, each heartbeat an echo in the silence. Then, a faint movement. The woman's eyes fluttered, and her shallow breathing deepened. A wave of relief rippled through the cabin, punctuated by soft murmurs of gratitude. Douglas exhaled, not realizing he had been holding his breath. His eyes met Marcus's as the Major sat back, a slight nod of acknowledgement passing between them. It was a silent truce, a moment of shared humanity that neither man could deny. Kyle's admiration for Marcus turned into something more profound. A realization that true strength was not in dominance or wealth, but in service and compassion. He glanced at Douglas, hoping to see recognition in his father's eyes. What he saw instead was something he hadn't expected. Tears welling up, unspilled but present. Douglas swallowed hard, feeling exposed in a way he hadn't in decades. The barriers he had erected, built from years of inherited beliefs and reinforced by habit, began to crack under the weight of the truth in front of him. Here was a man who had no obligation to act, no reason to be kind beyond the simple fact that it was right. The plane stabilized, and life resumed its rhythms, but for those in first class, the moment lingered like an unspoken promise, a reminder of what lay beneath the surface, waiting to be understood. The immediate crisis had passed, leaving the cabin in a state of uneasy calm. The woman, now awake and breathing steadily, rested with her husband's hand firmly grasping hers. Claire, moving efficiently, expressed her gratitude to Marcus with a soft, "Thank you, Major," that carried the weight of sincere respect. Marcus nodded once and took his seat again, a quiet dignity enveloping him. The passengers around him murmured their thanks, eyes following him with a mix of awe and newfound understanding. The tension that had shadowed him since Douglas's initial complaint now shifted. Suspicion and prejudice were replaced with something more complex. Admiration, maybe even guilt. Douglas sat motionless, staring at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time. He wanted to say something, but found the words caught in the net of his pride and confusion. Kyle leaned forward slightly, the light from the aisle casting shadows across his young, earnest face. "Dad," Kyle whispered, a note of urgency in his voice. "Do you see now?" Douglas turned to look at his son. The question pierced through him, simple but weighted with implication. It wasn't just about the flight anymore. It was about years of choices and beliefs, and the consequences they carried. He managed a small nod, barely perceptible, but it was enough for Kyle to see a crack in the facade. Claire approached Douglas and Kyle, her eyes landing briefly on Marcus before turning to the Carters. "Is there anything else you need?" she asked, her tone polite but cooler than before. Douglas felt the sting of subtle disapproval and shook his head. "No, thank you," he said, his voice subdued. The conversation between them was wordless, conveyed through glances and the unspoken acknowledgement of what had just transpired. Kyle waited until Claire moved away before speaking. "He didn't have to do that," he said softly, more to himself than to Douglas. The words echoed in Douglas's mind, sharp and unyielding. He watched Marcus, who had returned to reading, seemingly unbothered by the attention or the shift in the atmosphere. Douglas's thoughts roamed, trying to find footing in this new understanding. It was unsettling to realize that the beliefs he'd held, passed down from his father and cemented over years of reinforcement, were not immutable. Here was proof that people, actions, and intentions were more complex than simple categories of us and them. The captain's voice returned, announcing that the plane had cleared the patch of turbulence and was cruising smoothly once again. The calm tone reassured most passengers, who resumed their conversations or returned to their movies and books. But for Douglas, the change in the air was not something that could be so easily dismissed. He took a deep breath and turned slightly in his seat. The words were difficult, sticking in his throat like rough stones, but he pushed them out. "Major Hayes," Douglas said, the formality an olive branch of sorts. Marcus looked up, his eyes meeting Douglas's. They held no resentment, just a quiet curiosity. Douglas paused, feeling the eyes of those nearby on him. "Thank you for what you did." There was a beat of silence before Marcus responded, his voice steady and kind. "Anyone would have done the same?" The simplicity of the statement challenged Douglas, forcing him to consider why it was Marcus who had acted, and not himself or others. Kyle, watching the exchange, felt the knot of tension in his chest ease slightly. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a start. As the flight pressed on, the initial drama became a story passengers would recount to friends and family. Marcus's act of stepping in during the emergency transformed the atmosphere, infusing it with respect and quiet contemplation. Douglas shifted in his seat, discomfort giving way to introspection. He remembered his father's lessons, the stories that were more warnings than teachings. "The world doesn't change, Doug. It stays in its lanes." But that wasn't true, he realized now. The world did change, sometimes painfully, sometimes slowly, but it did. Kyle sensed the shift in his father, a softening that made him feel hope. He reached for his earbuds, but instead of putting them on, he turned to Marcus, who had resumed reading. "What's the book?" Kyle asked, his voice steady. Marcus glanced at the cover, a slight smile touching his lips. "Meditations by Marcus Aurelius," he said. "A collection of thoughts on resilience, patience, and understanding." Kyle's eyes lit up. "Is it good?" "It's more than good," Marcus replied. "It's a reminder that we choose who we want to be, no matter what happens around us." Douglas listened, each word adding to the quiet reckoning inside him. He remembered the moments in his life when he could have chosen differently. Interactions that now seemed significant in their missed potential. The plane thrummed beneath him, a gentle reminder of the journey they were on. Not just through the air, but through the spaces between perception and reality. The flight continued, but the silence between Douglas and Marcus was no longer uncomfortable. It was an understanding, tentative but genuine. Marcus's actions had broken the boundaries of assumptions, not just for Douglas, but for everyone who had watched. Even Eleanor, who had witnessed the events with keen interest, turned to Marcus one last time, a soft smile on her lips. "You're more than just a story, Major," she said quietly. Marcus's smile widened, the depth of his character revealed not just in his actions, but in how he responded, with humility, without expectation. Douglas took in the scene, his heart heavy but no longer with resentment. Instead, it was filled with questions. Questions he knew he would need to ask himself. And, perhaps one day, Marcus too. He glanced at Kyle, who looked back with a small, hopeful smile. The moment felt like a chance, an invitation to start something different. The night deepened, the plane pressing on toward its destination. Conversations quieted. Passengers adjusted their seats for sleep, and the cabin lights dimmed until only the glow of reading lamps punctuated the darkness. In the quiet, Marcus turned a page of his book, and Douglas closed his eyes, the weight of transformation beginning to take root. The rhythmic hum of the engines wrapped the cabin in a cocoon of sound. Some passengers had drifted into light slumbers, the occasional rustle of blankets or soft conversation punctuating the silence. Marcus remained awake, eyes drifting between the pages of his book and the sleeping passengers around him. To an outsider, he looked serene, but years of service had taught him to remain vigilant, even during moments of peace. Douglas, sitting across the aisle, felt the weight of exhaustion, but could not sleep. The exchange he'd had with Marcus replayed in his mind, each word peeling back the layers of beliefs that had once felt so unshakable. He glanced at Kyle, whose head was tilted back, eyes closed but not fully at ease. The boy's hand gripped the armrest tightly, even in rest, as if holding on to something more than just the seat. The plane jolted with unexpected force, pulling startled gasps from passengers. Douglas's eyes shot open, and Kyle sat up abruptly, disoriented and wide-eyed. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, strained but composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are encountering unexpected turbulence." The cabin became a flurry of motion as people hurried to comply. Marcus placed his book down and secured his seatbelt, eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. The turbulence grew stronger, causing trays to rattle and whispers of unease to swell into low murmurs. Claire moved up the aisle, steady despite the shifting plane. She checked passengers' belts, offering calm reassurances. When she reached Douglas's row, her smile was strained but genuine. "Everything all right here?" she asked, a practiced warmth in her voice. Douglas nodded stiffly, glancing at Kyle, who gave a quick, tight smile. But before Claire could move on, the plane lurched again, more violently this time. A yelp from a few rows back drew attention, a child clutching her mother, eyes wide with fright. Amid the growing tension, the sound of a distressed voice cut through the noise. "Help! My husband!" The plea came from an older woman, her tone sharp with panic. Passengers turned, eyes darting to see a man in an aisle seat slumped forward, unmoving. Claire's face paled, but she moved quickly, calling out, "Is there a doctor on board?" Marcus's instincts took over. He unfastened his seatbelt and moved toward the distressed couple, ignoring the way the plane shuddered beneath his feet. The murmurs of the passengers grew louder as Marcus knelt beside the man, his hands checking for a pulse and assessing the situation with practiced calm. "I have medical training," Marcus said, voice steady and commanding. Claire nodded, relief flooding her features as she passed him the emergency medical kit. The cabin watched, a captive audience to the unfolding drama. Even those who had initially dismissed Marcus now looked at him with wide eyes, their perceptions shifting in real time. Douglas felt a rush of conflicting emotions: fear for the man, awe at Marcus's composure, and a gnawing guilt that twisted in his chest. Kyle, on the other hand, watched with admiration, a silent cheer in his heart for the man who seemed larger than life. Marcus checked the man's breathing, applying a calm but firm pressure to the man's chest to stimulate a response. "I need oxygen," he instructed Claire, who moved quickly to retrieve it. The cabin was eerily quiet, punctuated only by the hum of the engines and the soft cries of the distressed woman. The seconds stretched unbearably, each one dragging with the weight of collective anxiety. Passengers craned their necks to see, some whispering prayers, others gripping their armrests. Finally, the man's chest rose as Marcus secured the oxygen mask over his face. A collective sigh rippled through the cabin, followed by murmured relief. The older woman's eyes welled with tears, gratitude etched in every line of her face. "Thank you," she whispered, voice breaking. Marcus nodded, his own expression steady but touched with quiet empathy. He helped the man's wife ensure the oxygen was secure before standing, the strength in his posture unwavering. The moment felt surreal to Douglas, as if he were watching a movie instead of experiencing it firsthand. Marcus's actions challenged every narrative he had held on to. Here was a man who had been judged, reduced by assumptions, now rising to meet a crisis with a courage that left Douglas feeling small in comparison. For the first time in years, Douglas felt the sting of self-awareness. He glanced at Kyle, whose eyes shone with pride. The boy leaned forward, catching Marcus's eye and giving him a grateful nod. Marcus returned it with a subtle, understanding smile. Douglas swallowed hard, the pride in his son's gaze a reminder that he had a choice: to continue on the path shaped by his father's beliefs, or to start forging his own. New understanding. As the plane steadied and the turbulence waned, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted from tense to reflective. Passengers turned to each other, speaking in hushed tones about what they had just witnessed. The elderly couple held hands, the man now conscious but pale, his wife clinging to Marcus's earlier words of reassurance. Claire made her way down the aisle, her eyes meeting Marcus's. "Major Hayes, thank you. You really saved him." "It's what anyone would do," Marcus replied, echoing the words he had offered Douglas earlier. But this time, Douglas felt the full weight of their meaning. Kyle looked at his father, hope mingled with challenge in his expression. "Anyone?" he repeated softly, as if inviting Douglas to see beyond the moment. Douglas nodded, a small gesture that carried a promise. To himself, to Kyle, and, in an unspoken way, to Marcus. Change, he realized, started with acknowledging the need for it. The plane pressed on through the night, its path unwavering as it cut across the dark expanse, carrying stories that had shifted and grown in unexpected ways. The plane glided forward, the turbulence now a memory, but the tension in the cabin replaced by a heavy, contemplative quiet. Marcus sat back in his seat, his breathing even as he glanced down at his hands. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind only a quiet weariness and the familiar feeling of being seen and unseen at the same time. Kyle's voice cut through the silence, soft but determined. "Thank you for what you did, Major." He spoke from across the aisle, and his words carried a sincerity that made Marcus look up, surprised. A smile touched Marcus's lips, not wide but enough to warm the distance between them. "I'm glad I could help," he said, meeting Kyle's eyes with a nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't lost on Marcus that the boy's face was alight with admiration. His earlier embarrassment at his father's behavior now replaced with something more resolute. Douglas watched the exchange, a tightness in his chest that refused to dissipate. His son's gratitude only emphasized how far he himself had yet to go. The realization twisted inside him, uncomfortable but necessary. Douglas cleared his throat, the sound breaking the quiet like a pebble tossed into a still pond. He leaned slightly toward Marcus, searching for the words that had eluded him since the flight began. "I wanted to say, I was wrong. Earlier." His voice was low, strained with the effort of admitting fault. The admission hung between them, fragile but significant. Marcus's expression remained calm, but there was a subtle shift in his eyes, a glimmer of acknowledgement that didn't soften into relief, but stayed steady. "We all learn," Marcus said simply, turning back to his book. The words weren't dismissive. They were an offering, an acceptance that growth was a process, not an instant transformation. Douglas nodded, a heaviness lifting from his shoulders even as the weight of responsibility settled in its place. He wasn't absolved, but the path to change was now visible, a road he knew would require more than words. Kyle watched his father and Marcus, a cautious hope blooming inside him. This was the first time he'd seen Douglas admit a fault so openly. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to shift the way Kyle saw his father. The man who had always seemed unyielding now looked more human, more fallible. Kyle's gaze shifted back to Marcus, whose calm had inspired him throughout the flight. The teenager opened his mouth, hesitated, then spoke. "Major, do you think people can change?" Marcus turned, his expression thoughtful. "I think people can learn, and when they do, they can choose to change." His eyes met Kyle's with a gravity that belied the casual question. "The choice is always there." Kyle nodded slowly, understanding that the answer was as much for him as it was for Douglas. He sat back in his seat, feeling a new respect not only for Marcus, but for the journey he and his father were beginning. The elderly couple from earlier looked over, the wife's eyes still glistening with the aftermath of fear and relief. "Thank you again, Major," she said softly, her voice breaking the delicate web of silence in the cabin. Other passengers nodded, a collective acknowledgement of the extraordinary moments they had witnessed. Marcus's humility remained intact as he responded, "I was glad to help." He didn't meet the gratitude with boastfulness or self-importance, only a quiet acceptance that spoke to the depth of his character. Douglas listened, the warmth of the passengers' gratitude prickling at his own conscience. The way they responded to Marcus contrasted sharply with the way he had acted earlier. He felt Kyle's gaze on him again and knew that his next actions, both here and in the future, would speak louder than any apology ever could. The cabin lights dimmed as the crew signaled the nighttime rest period. Passengers adjusted their seats, murmuring among themselves as the mood slowly returned to one of cautious peace. But the air felt different now, charged with the shared experience that had transformed the strangers into silent witnesses of a lesson more profound than any conversation could have conveyed. Claire approached Marcus once more, her eyes kind and soft. "You've done more for this flight than you know," she said, in a near whisper, her professional demeanor melting into genuine gratitude. Marcus nodded, his smile faint but genuine. Douglas shifted again, catching Kyle's eye. This time, when he looked at his son, he didn't see just a boy, but someone capable of questioning the world, of making choices different from the ones he had been handed. It was a realization that both frightened and emboldened him. Marcus leaned back, closing his eyes for the first time with a sense of peace. The emergency was over, but its echoes would resonate long after the flight had landed. The flight continued its course, the night outside a dark, endless canvas. Sleep came in patches for many passengers, but for Douglas, it was elusive. He watched Kyle, who had finally relaxed, and Marcus, who had dozed off, still radiating calm even in rest. Douglas reached for his phone, the dim light casting a glow on his face as he opened a blank note. He stared at the screen for a moment before typing two simple words. "Remember this." It was a reminder to himself, a promise that the events of this flight would not dissolve into the routines of life, but would push him toward something better. For himself and for Kyle. The quiet settled around them, but the lessons lingered, weaving through the cabin like an invisible current. This flight, once a simple journey across the ocean, had become a story that would follow them all, binding their memories to something deeper. The realization that change begins in moments like these, sparked by acts of courage and recognition. Douglas leaned back, the hum of the engines a steady rhythm that matched the thrum of his own thoughts. The moments following Marcus's intervention were a blur of gratitude from passengers, whispers exchanged across rows, and the glow of admiration on Kyle's face. All of it underscored a truth Douglas could no longer ignore. Assumptions had blinded him, and now they were unraveling. He turned to look at Marcus, now resting with his arms folded, eyes closed in what seemed to be a brief but deserved pause. For the first time, Douglas saw him not as a stranger, but as a man layered with experiences he couldn't fathom. Decisions made under duress, lives saved, burdens carried with grace. Douglas exhaled, the realization settling in his chest like a stone. He thought back to his father's stern lessons, words passed down with the expectation of adherence. "Stick with what you know, Dougie. Anything else will only weaken you." But what if strength wasn't what he had believed? What if it looked more like Marcus, standing firm in service and humility, rather than the narrow pride he had learned to cultivate? Kyle shifted in his seat, stealing glances at his father. The moments since Marcus's intervention had changed something between them, softening the distance that had stretched over the years. It was as though the unspoken words in the cabin were urging them toward something new, an understanding, a bridge. "Dad?" Kyle's voice was hesitant, as if testing the waters. Douglas turned, his expression softer than it had been in years. "Yes, son? Do you think it's hard?" Kyle continued, eyes darting between Marcus and his father. "Being someone who has to help, even when it's risky?" Douglas followed Kyle's gaze, taking in the way Marcus's chest rose and fell evenly as he rested. He considered the question carefully. "I think it takes a kind of strength most people don't have," he admitted, the confession surprising even himself. Kyle nodded, a quiet smile forming at the corners of his mouth. It was the answer he had hoped for, not because it solved everything, but because it was honest. It was the beginning of something different, a thread that, if nurtured, could become a bond stronger than the unchallenged beliefs that had kept them apart. Around them, passengers resumed conversations, but the tone had shifted. The man across the aisle, a young professional who had been typing frantically on his laptop earlier, now paused to glance at Marcus with a look of newfound respect. Eleanor, the elderly woman whose earlier conversation with Marcus had hinted at his reputation, watched with eyes glistening with pride. The cabin had witnessed something significant, a moment that transcended the usual boundaries of travel. Marcus's quiet heroism had not only saved a life, but had also revealed the unseen threads that connected them all, if only briefly. Claire moved through the aisle again, checking on passengers. When she reached Marcus's row, she hesitated, then leaned in. "You should know," she said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. "Everyone here saw what you did. It meant more than you think." Marcus opened his eyes, the weight of her words visible in the slight softening of his expression. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement that he understood. For him, actions had always spoken louder than words, and this flight was no exception. Douglas shifted in his seat, catching snippets of the whispered conversations around him. He watched as passengers exchanged stories about Marcus's act of heroism, their voices full of respect. It was a stark contrast to the hushed, wary glances Marcus had received when boarding. The shift wasn't just external, it was happening within Douglas, too. He leaned over to Kyle, voice low but resolute. "I was wrong," he said, the admission raw and unfamiliar. "About him? About a lot of things." Kyle's eyes widened, a flicker of hope sparking in them. "I know, Dad," he replied, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. The exchange felt like a small victory, a step in a new direction. Across the aisle, Marcus caught the glance shared between father and son. He didn't say anything, but offered a brief nod when their eyes met, a silent message. It's never too late to learn. As the flight began its slow descent into early morning, the cabin lights brightened gradually, signaling that the journey was nearing its end. Passengers stirred, gathering their belongings and stretching tired limbs. But the atmosphere retained the weight of the night's events. Douglas looked out at the first hints of dawn breaking over the horizon. The light touched the edges of the clouds with a soft golden glow, as if symbolizing the possibility of a new beginning. He turned to Kyle, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the boy's questions, his courage to see things differently. "Maybe when we get home," Douglas said, his voice uncertain but open, "we could talk more about this, about what we saw here." Kyle's smile widened, eyes brightening with relief. "I'd like that," he said. As the plane touched down, the cabin erupted into applause. A common gesture, but this time it felt charged with meaning. Marcus offered a subtle smile, the acknowledgement of a job well done, but also of something deeper, the impact of moments that extend beyond the moment itself. The plane touched down with a gentle thud, rolling smoothly along the runway as passengers applauded. The cabin lights brightened fully, dispelling the shadows that had cloaked the flight in a veil of intimacy and introspection. Outside, the early morning sky blushed with the first light of dawn, painting a backdrop that felt symbolic. Fresh, open, and full of promise. Douglas stared out the window, the applause washing over him like a wave. He'd spent the last few hours teetering between introspection and discomfort, aware that the experience had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The truth was raw, churning beneath his polished exterior. Kyle unbuckled his seatbelt and stretched, glancing over at Marcus, who was preparing to disembark. The teenager felt a deep pull to speak with the man who had quietly redefined heroism for him, but hesitation lingered. "Go on," Douglas said quietly, catching the look in Kyle's eyes. There was no judgment in his voice, only a resigned acceptance. Kyle hesitated, then stood, approaching Marcus with a mixture of nerves and admiration. "Major Hayes?" Kyle's voice was tentative, but it carried across the few feet that separated them. Marcus turned, a soft smile forming as he met Kyle's gaze. "Yes? Thank you again." "For everything," Kyle said, his sincerity palpable. Marcus inclined his head, his expression thoughtful. "You're welcome. But remember, it's what we do with what we see and learn that matters." The words struck a chord in Kyle, and he nodded, absorbing the lesson like a seed planted in fertile ground. He stepped back, giving Marcus a grateful smile before moving to join his father, who had watched the exchange in silence, a tightness in his throat. As the passengers began gathering their belongings, Eleanor caught Marcus's attention with a light touch on his arm. "You have a gift, Major," she said, her voice hushed but firm. "It's not just what you did, it's who you are that makes the difference." Marcus's eyes softened. "And thank you, Mrs. Green. Sometimes we all need reminders of what's important." Nearby, Douglas listened, every word carving deeper into his understanding of what he had witnessed. He felt the eyes of others on him, no longer judgmental, but curious, perhaps even forgiving. The space between who he was and who he wanted to be felt both vast and surmountable. As the line to exit the plane moved forward, Douglas stepped into the aisle and found himself next to Marcus. The silence between them was loaded, but no longer hostile. It was Marcus who broke it, his voice low and steady. "Take care of each other. That's what counts." Douglas swallowed, nodding as he met Marcus's gaze. It was a moment both humbling and inspiring. "I'll remember that," he said, and he meant it. The cool air of the jet bridge felt sharp against Douglas's face as he stepped out, followed closely by Kyle. The airport around them was waking up, its energy beginning to pulse with the new day. People bustled, announcements echoed, and the hum of conversations filled the space. But for Douglas and Kyle, the world outside the plane felt slightly different. They watched as Marcus walked ahead, greeted by a few passengers who nodded or murmured their thanks once more. Douglas took a deep breath, a sense of gratitude swelling within him that felt foreign but welcome. "Dad?" Kyle's voice was cautious, pulling Douglas's attention. "Yes, Kyle?" "I'm glad you said something to him," Kyle admitted, a small, hopeful smile breaking through his usual guarded expression. Douglas reached out, placing a hand on Kyle's shoulder. "Me too, son. Me too." As they moved through customs and baggage claim, the events of the flight began to settle into memory, not as distant as most travel experiences, but close, vivid, and unforgettable. Douglas felt the shift in himself with each step. The terminal was crowded, full of reunions and departures, but he found himself searching for one last glimpse of Marcus before they left. He spotted him just beyond the sliding glass doors, standing tall under the soft light of morning. Marcus turned, sensing eyes on him, and caught sight of the Carters. He lifted a hand in a silent farewell, a gesture that felt final but also like a beginning. Douglas returned the gesture, a small but significant act of recognition. Kyle waved too, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. He knew that this wasn't just a story they'd tell about a dramatic flight. It was a marker of something deeper, an experience that would shape the conversations they would have and the choices they would make from now on. The ride to their hotel was quiet, the city waking up around them as the streets began to fill with cars and pedestrians. Douglas watched the scenery pass, the world outside moving at its usual pace, while everything within him felt slow and deliberate. Kyle broke the silence. "Dad, do you think we'll ever see him again?" Douglas's lips curved into a thoughtful smile. "Maybe," he said, "and if we don't, we'll remember what he taught us." The words settled in the air between them, carrying the weight of promise and change. Kyle nodded, content with the answer. He reached for his phone, not to retreat behind it as usual, but to jot down a note. "Be more like Marcus." It was simple, but it was enough for now. As they pulled up to their hotel, the sun had fully risen, casting the city in gold. It felt like a new beginning, a day where choices would be made with the echoes of one night's lesson guiding them. And though neither father nor son knew exactly what the future would hold, they both understood that moments of clarity, no matter how unexpected, could change everything. The hotel room was quiet, a stark contrast to the noise and movement of the airport and plane. Douglas dropped his bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, his gaze fixed on the window where the city outside buzzed with morning activity. He felt the weight of exhaustion press down on him, but it wasn't just physical. It was the kind of fatigue that came from carrying the burden of long-held beliefs and realizing they no longer fit. Kyle walked over to his own bed, setting down his backpack. He paused, glancing at his father. The usual space between them felt smaller now, filled with questions neither of them had asked before. "Do you want to talk?" Kyle ventured, his voice tentative but hopeful. Douglas looked up, surprised by the question. The idea of opening up, even a little, was new territory. He took a deep breath and nodded. "Yeah, Kyle, I think I do." For the first time in years, the room was filled with more than just polite, routine exchanges. Kyle sat cross-legged on his bed, watching his father with a mix of curiosity and caution. Douglas rubbed his hands together, searching for where to begin. When I was growing up, Douglas started, his voice steady but distant, I was taught a certain way of looking at the world. My father, your grandfather, he believed in tradition and keeping things as they were. It was simple, black and white, and I thought that was right for a long time. Kyle listened, the silence between them pulling his father's words closer, making them more real. Did you ever question it? He asked, his voice softer than before. No, Douglas admitted, a rueful smile flickering and then fading. Not really. It was easier not to. But today, this flight, I realized how wrong that was. Marcus, he made me see that strength isn't about holding on to what's familiar. It's about knowing when to let go and when to change. The room held its breath, a moment of shared understanding forming. Kyle's eyes brightened with something like pride. This was the conversation he'd been hoping for. The one that suggested there was more to his father than strict rules and stubborn beliefs. Thanks, Dad, Kyle said quietly, looking down at his hands. I think that's the first time I've heard you say something like that. Douglas smiled, a little wider this time, feeling something break open inside him. And it won't be the last, he said. I promise. Douglas stood and walked to the window, the city spreading out beneath them like a living, breathing map. The streets were already bustling, cars inching forward, people moving with purpose. He thought about the moments on the plane. Marcus moving quickly to help, the sound of passengers holding their breath. Kyle's voice breaking the tension with gratitude. Each memory carried a weight that pressed down on him, but it also lightened something inside. We should do something to thank him, Kyle said, breaking Douglas's reverie. Douglas nodded, considering the idea. Yes, we should. Even if we don't see him again, there are ways to honor what he did. It's about carrying that moment forward, not just leaving it on the plane. The teenager's face lit up. Maybe we can start by talking to people more, by not assuming things. Exactly, Douglas agreed. The realization felt solid, like the first step onto a bridge that led somewhere better. Kyle sat up, an idea forming in his mind. Do you think we could write to him? Let him know what this meant to us? Douglas paused, the thought resonating deeply. Yes, I think we should. It's the least we can do. They spent the next few minutes drafting a message together, careful and thoughtful with their words. It was addressed to Marcus, thanking him not just for what he did on the flight, but for what he showed them without trying. Courage, compassion, and the importance of looking beyond first impressions. Dear Major Hayes, it began, we wanted to express our gratitude for your actions on the flight and for the lessons you taught us without even knowing. Your strength and humility inspired us in ways we're still understanding. Douglas felt a warmth in his chest as they crafted the words, each sentence chipping away at the silence that had once defined his relationship with Kyle. It was a start, a gesture that, though small, carried a profound weight. The first rays of sunlight poured through the window, casting long, warm beams across the room. Douglas looked at Kyle, who was now stretching and preparing for the day ahead. The city outside had fully awakened, the noise rising to a hum that spoke of life and movement. Ready for breakfast? Douglas asked, his voice light but steady. Yeah, Kyle said, a smile breaking across his face. It was a smile that mirrored the one Douglas felt within, subtle but genuine. As they headed toward the door, Douglas glanced back at the room, the memory of the flight now woven into the fabric of who they were. It was just the beginning, but it was enough for now. The hotel dining area was lively, filled with the hum of conversation and the clatter of cutlery. Douglas and Kyle sat at a corner table near a window that offered a view of the bustling street below. The morning sun filtered through the glass, casting warm patterns on the table. Kyle sipped his orange juice, glancing at his father as they waited for their food. There was an unspoken ease between them, an awareness that the events of the flight had changed something fundamental. Douglas tapped his fingers absently on the table, eyes distant but not unfocused. Dad, what are you thinking about? Kyle asked, curiosity drawing him in. Douglas met his son's gaze, the usual sternness softened. I was thinking about Marcus and what he said about choosing to change. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I want to make better choices, Kyle. For you, for us." Kyle's chest swelled with an unfamiliar warmth. He nodded, knowing that change would be gradual, but feeling hopeful nonetheless. "Me too, Dad." Their breakfast arrived, and as they ate, Douglas noticed things he hadn't before. The mix of people in the room, the subtle ways they interacted, the smiles and nods exchanged. It felt like seeing the world with clearer eyes, a shift that made him realize how much he'd missed by staying confined to a narrow view. Kyle, emboldened by their newfound openness, shared stories from school, talking animatedly about friends and ideas that had once seemed unimportant to his father. Douglas listened, genuinely interested, seeing his son as more than just an extension of himself, but as someone with his own thoughts and questions. "Dad, do you think Marcus is still in the city?" Kyle asked between bites of scrambled eggs. Douglas's brow furrowed thoughtfully. "Maybe, if we run into him again, we'll tell him what this meant to us." A few tables over, an older couple who had been on their flight caught their eye and nodded in recognition. The woman leaned over to whisper something to her husband, who nodded solemnly. Douglas felt a mix of embarrassment and relief. The events of the flight had reached beyond their small family circle. As they prepared to leave the dining area, the muted sound of a nearby television caught their attention. A news segment about their flight played on the screen, a reporter summarizing the story of the unexpected medical emergency and the hero who had intervened. Major Marcus Hayes, a decorated military officer, provided life-saving assistance mid-flight, impressing passengers and crew alike. Eyewitnesses described his composure and skill. Kyle's eyes lit up, and he nudged Douglas. "Look, Dad, it's him." Douglas turned to watch the screen, a swell of pride and something deeper tightening in his chest. He realized that Marcus's actions had resonated far beyond their flight, becoming a story others would hear and learn from. It was humbling to see how one act of kindness, courage, and skill could ripple outward. They spent the day exploring the city, the usual chatter replaced with moments of shared reflection. Kyle asked more questions about life, about beliefs, and about how people could change. Douglas answered as best as he could, admitting when he didn't know, which was new territory for him. The honesty felt freeing. At a park bench, shaded by trees, they sat with ice cream cones in hand. The air was filled with the scent of flowers and the laughter of children playing nearby. Douglas looked at Kyle, his son's face animated as he talked about how he wanted to join a community service project at school. "You think that's a good idea?" Kyle asked, a mix of excitement and uncertainty in his voice. Douglas smiled, the tension of years easing further. "I think it's a great idea, Kyle. Helping others, learning from people different than us, it's important. More than I realized before." Kyle's grin was wide, his eyes shining with gratitude. It was a moment that marked more than just a day in the park. It marked a new chapter in how they would move forward. Later that evening, as they walked through the city square where street performers entertained passers-by, Douglas caught sight of a familiar figure. Marcus stood by a coffee cart, a paper cup in his hand, and a relaxed expression on his face as he watched a violinist play nearby. "Dad," Kyle whispered, spotting him too. "It's Marcus." They approached slowly, a mix of nervousness and anticipation tightening in Douglas's chest. Marcus turned slightly, noticing them with a hint of surprise. He nodded, his posture relaxed but attentive. "Major Hayes," Douglas said, his voice steady but warm. "We weren't expecting to see you again." Marcus's expression was unreadable for a moment, then he smiled. "The world has a way of bringing people back together at the right times." Kyle stepped forward. "We wanted to say thank you again for everything. It really meant a lot." Marcus looked between them, his eyes settling on Douglas, who nodded in agreement. "You changed more than just that moment on the plane," Douglas said, the sincerity clear in his voice. "You reminded us of what really matters." Marcus's smile deepened, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "It's not just what we do in moments of crisis that define us, it's what we do after. I'm glad to see you both here, moving forward." They exchanged a few more words before parting, the encounter brief but impactful. As Marcus walked away, his figure disappearing into the crowd, Douglas felt lighter. The city lights glowed softly around them, and he realized that this was the beginning of something lasting, not just a fleeting moment. The ride back to the hotel was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy silence of the past. It was comfortable, full of thoughts that didn't need to be spoken just yet. Douglas glanced at Kyle, who was looking out the window, the neon signs of the city reflecting in his eyes. "Dad?" Kyle finally said, breaking the silence. "Yes, I think this was the best trip we've ever had." Douglas's chest tightened, not with regret but with hope. "I think so too, Kyle." They didn't need to say more. The shared understanding was enough. And as the city rolled by outside, vibrant and alive, it felt like they were finally part of something larger. Something connected by more than the past they came from. It was about the future they were ready to embrace. The next morning came with the promise of clear skies and a fresh start. The hotel lobby was a mix of guests checking out, groups chatting over coffee, and the occasional sound of rolling suitcases. Douglas and Kyle lingered near a window, looking out at the city they had explored together. "Are you ready to head home?" Douglas asked, the question carrying more weight than just their travel plans. Kyle nodded, then looked up at his father with a thoughtful expression. "I am, but I want to remember this trip for more than just the flight. I don't want us to forget what we talked about." Douglas's chest tightened with emotion. The teenager standing before him had always been perceptive, but now he seemed older, wiser in a way that came from witnessing change firsthand. "We won't forget," Douglas said, a promise in his tone. "This is where we start making it count." As they checked out and stepped outside into the crisp morning air, Douglas felt the weight of the past begin to shift. It wasn't gone. Deep-seated beliefs and old habits didn't vanish overnight, but it had less hold over him now. And that was a beginning. The story of Marcus's actions on the plane had gained traction. News outlets picked up the human interest piece, highlighting not just the emergency, but the stories shared by passengers. Words like courage and compassion appeared in headlines, paired with interviews that spoke of the quiet way Marcus had moved through the flight, commanding respect without seeking it. At the airport, Douglas and Kyle passed a large screen showing a news report. A clip of Marcus, taken from a past public appearance, played as a voiceover recounted the story. Passengers paused to watch, and Douglas noticed a few of them exchanging nods and whispers. It struck him how one moment could create connections between people who had never met. Kyle stopped to watch the segment, his eyes wide with admiration. "Dad, that's him," he said, pointing at the screen. Douglas nodded, a sense of pride and humility mingling within him. The world seemed a little smaller, a little more connected, knowing that stories like Marcus's could spread far and wide, leaving their mark on more than just the passengers of one flight. Back home, life settled into familiar patterns, but the memory of the flight stayed vivid. One evening, Douglas sat at his desk, pen in hand. He had agreed with Kyle's idea of writing to Marcus, but putting his thoughts into words felt daunting. He stared at the blank page, feeling the weight of all he wanted to say. "Dear Major Hayes," he wrote, pausing as the first words anchored him to the moment. "It's taken me time to find the right words. But I wanted you to know that your actions on the flight changed more than just the outcome of an emergency. You changed the way I see the world, the way I see myself, and the way I want to be for my son." The letter continued, each sentence written with care. Douglas didn't rush, allowing the honesty to guide him. He spoke of his initial misjudgment and how Marcus's actions had been a quiet challenge to the beliefs he had once held tightly. When he finished, he sat back, feeling lighter and more resolved than before. Kyle appeared at the door, hesitant. "Did you write it?" Douglas held up the letter, a small, hopeful smile on his face. "I did. Want to read it?" Kyle nodded, stepping into the room and taking the letter from his father. As he read, the room was filled with a comfortable silence, the kind that suggested they were finally on the same path. The letter sent, Douglas and Kyle began to integrate what they had learned into their daily lives. They volunteered at a local community center, a place where people from different backgrounds gathered for classes, meals, and conversation. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was meaningful. At first, Douglas felt out of place, unsure how to approach conversations or contribute. But with time, he grew more comfortable, discovering that listening was as important as speaking. The stories he heard, the challenges and triumphs of others, taught him lessons that textbooks and business meetings never had. Kyle flourished in the environment, making friends easily and stepping up to help organize events. He spoke with passion about projects they could undertake together, from community cleanups to fundraisers for local schools. Each day spent at the center was a step away from the old habits that had defined them, and a step toward something better. Weeks later, an envelope arrived addressed to Douglas and Kyle. The handwriting was neat and precise, the return address unfamiliar but promising. Douglas's heart thudded as he opened it, pulling out a single sheet of paper. "Dear Douglas and Kyle," it read, "thank you for your letter. It means more than you know to hear that our paths crossing made a difference. I've always believed that change starts with a moment, but it continues with the choices we make after. Keep making those choices, and I know the impact will reach further than you think. With gratitude, Marcus Hayes." Douglas read the letter aloud to Kyle, who grinned, eyes bright with excitement. The message was simple but profound, a reminder that growth was a journey, not a destination. "Looks like he believes in us too," Kyle said, pride in his voice. Douglas nodded, feeling the truth of it settle in his chest. And that's all the more reason to keep moving forward. The next few months brought subtle but meaningful changes. Douglas found himself seeking out conversations he would have once avoided. At the community center, he listened to stories from people with backgrounds different from his own. Each encounter a reminder of Marcus's words, "We all have things to learn." One afternoon, during a volunteer shift, Douglas met Rosa, an elderly woman who had been a teacher for decades before retiring. She spoke with an energy that belied her age, recounting stories of students who overcame obstacles that once seemed insurmountable. As she spoke, Douglas felt a pang of recognition. Her stories resonated with the lessons Marcus had embodied. "Life has a way of challenging what we think we know," Rosa said, her eyes twinkling with wisdom. "It's the learning that matters, not just the knowing." Douglas nodded, the truth of her words landing firmly. He glanced across the room where Kyle was helping a group of kids with a drawing project. His son's laughter filled the air, easy and light, and Douglas felt a surge of gratitude for the moments that had led them here. One evening, as the community center wrapped up for the day, Douglas was surprised to see Claire, the flight attendant from their eventful journey, standing near the entrance. She caught his eye and smiled, waving as she approached. "Douglas, isn't it?" Claire asked, her smile warm. "Yes, it's good to see you again," Douglas replied, the memory of that turbulent flight flickering between them. "I wanted to stop by and see what you and Kyle were doing," Claire said, glancing around at the busy center. "After that flight, I thought a lot about how small acts of courage and kindness can change everything. It's inspiring to see people take that idea and run with it." Douglas felt a swell of pride, knowing that their efforts were being noticed. "It's been a journey, but one worth taking," he said, meaning it. Kyle walked over, his eyes lighting up when he recognized Claire. "Hey, I remember you," Kyle said, grinning. Claire laughed. "Good memory, Kyle. I'm glad to see you're putting your energy to good use." The three stood for a moment, the unlikeliness of their shared connection a testament to how intertwined stories could become. It was a reminder that the lessons from that flight hadn't ended when the wheels touched down. They were continuing in moments like this, spreading outward like ripples in water. One evening at home, after a long day at the community center, Douglas sat in his study, flipping through old family photos. He paused at a picture of his father, stern and proud, standing in front of their childhood home. The image carried a weight that was hard to ignore. Memories of the rigid beliefs that had once defined Douglas's own thinking. Kyle appeared at the doorway, noticing the photograph in his father's hands. "That's Grandpa, right?" he asked, stepping into the room. "Yes," Douglas said, setting the picture down. "He was complicated." Kyle sat down in the chair opposite. "Did he teach you to see the world the way you used to?" Douglas sighed. the honesty of the question pulling at him. Yes, he did. He believed that strength came from staying the same, from sticking with what you knew. And for a long time, I thought he was right. But you don't think that now, Kyle said, more a statement than a question. No, I don't, Douglas replied. I've realized that strength comes from being willing to change, to admit when you're wrong and try to do better. Marcus showed me that, even if he never knew it. The room was silent for a moment, filled with the weight of unspoken understanding. Kyle reached for the photograph, studying it for a moment before placing it back on the desk. Thanks for telling me, he said, standing up. I think it's important to know where we came from so we can see how far we've come. Douglas felt a deep sense of connection to his son, the gap between them smaller now than it had ever been. You're right, Kyle, he said. It is. At the next community event, Kyle stood in front of a small group, ready to share the story of their flight. He'd been encouraged by his father and a few friends to speak, and now, with the room's expectant silence surrounding him, he took a deep breath. It all started on a flight where I learned that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who help quietly, Kyle began, his voice steady. It wasn't just about what happened that night. It was about how that moment showed me, and my dad, that it's never too late to change how you see the world. The audience listened intently, nodding as Kyle recounted Marcus's act of bravery, the way it had shifted their understanding of courage and compassion. Douglas stood at the back of the room, watching with pride as his son spoke with conviction. And the thing is, Kyle concluded, it's what we do after those moments that really matters. It's how we choose to change. The room erupted into applause, but Kyle's eyes sought out Douglas, who nodded back, eyes shining with pride. The applause wasn't just for the story, it was for the journey they had taken to get here. A week later, as the community center prepared for another event, Douglas was surprised to see a familiar figure walk through the doors. Marcus, dressed casually and with a relaxed smile, stepped into the room, greeting a few people before his eyes landed on Douglas and Kyle. "Major Hayes," Kyle called out, excitement threading through his voice. Marcus approached, shaking hands with Douglas before turning to Kyle. "I heard what you said at the event," Marcus said, eyes warm with pride. "It takes courage to stand up and speak your truth." Kyle blushed, but stood a little taller. "Thanks to what you showed us, I knew it was worth saying." Douglas extended his hand, this time with a confidence rooted in genuine respect. "Marcus, it's good to see you again. Thank you for everything." Marcus shook his hand firmly, his expression serious but kind. "The best thanks is seeing what you're doing here," he said, glancing around at the lively room. "Keep going. The world needs more of this." As they talked, the noise of the room faded, and Douglas felt something settle inside him, a sense of peace and purpose he hadn't known he needed. Weeks turned into months, and the community center became a second home for Douglas and Kyle. The work they did, organizing events, connecting with new people, and fostering dialogue, became a foundation for deeper understanding and growth. Douglas found himself taking on a leadership role, not because he sought it, but because he earned the trust of those around him. One evening, Douglas spoke at a community meeting. He stood in front of familiar and new faces, feeling both nervous and grateful. The room quieted as he began. "I used to think change was something you avoided. That staying the same meant strength. But I've learned that real strength comes from being willing to listen, to grow, and to change." The audience nodded, some whispering to each other. Kyle stood at the back, a proud smile on his face. It was a testament to how far they had come, from a flight that had once symbolized division to a room now filled with unity. After the meeting, Douglas sat alone at a table watching the last few attendees leave. He felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up to see Rosa, her kind eyes full of approval. "You spoke well," she said. "It's not easy to admit when we're wrong, but it's powerful when we do." Douglas nodded, a wave of emotion washing over him. "I didn't know how much I needed to change until it was almost too late," he said quietly. "I owe Marcus, and people like you, more than I can say." Rosa smiled knowingly. "Then show it with what you do next. That's how we honor those lessons." The words resonated deeply with Douglas. He had spent years holding on to an identity shaped by his father, but now he was actively reshaping it, learning to lead with humility and openness. Kyle found new energy in his community work, driven by the example Marcus had set. He started a project at school focused on highlighting unsung heroes in their town. His friends helped him gather stories, creating a mural in the school hallway with portraits and quotes from people who had made a difference. One day, as they painted, a teacher approached Kyle. "This is incredible work," she said. "What inspired you to start this?" Kyle paused, paintbrush in hand, and smiled. "Someone who taught me that being strong means helping others, even when no one's watching." The mural became a symbol of resilience and compassion, drawing attention from local media and sparking conversations among students about what it meant to lead by example. The community center's biggest event of the year was a gathering focused on stories of hope and resilience. Douglas had invited Marcus, unsure if he would be able to attend, but hopeful nonetheless. When Marcus walked through the doors that evening, a wave of surprise and excitement rippled through the room. Marcus was greeted warmly, with handshakes and smiles from people who had heard of his quiet heroism. Kyle rushed over, his eyes bright. "You made it," he said, unable to hide his excitement. "I wouldn't miss it," Marcus replied, a hint of a smile on his face. Douglas approached, extending his hand. This time, it wasn't just a greeting, but a gesture full of meaning. "Welcome, Marcus. Your presence here is an honor." They talked for a while, catching up and reflecting on how far things had come since that flight. Marcus listened as Kyle shared his school project, his pride evident in the way his eyes softened. The evening carried on, filled with stories shared by people from all walks of life. Midway through the event, Marcus was invited to speak. He stood in front of the crowd, his presence commanding but approachable. The room quieted as he began. Acts of courage are often seen as grand gestures, but most of the time, they're the quiet decisions we make every day, he said, his voice steady. "It's in listening, in reaching out, and in choosing compassion when it would be easier to look away." Douglas felt the truth of those words resonate deeply. He looked at Kyle, who listened with rapt attention, taking in every word. "It's what we do with those moments that defines us," Marcus continued. "And I see a room full of people who are ready to make those choices, not just once, but over and over again." The applause was loud and genuine, echoing in the space and filling it with hope. Marcus stepped down, greeted by people who wanted to thank him, shake his hand, and share their own stories of change. The event wound down, and Douglas found himself standing with Kyle outside, looking up at the night sky. The air was crisp, carrying with it the energy of the evening stories and the subtle hum of city life. "Tonight was amazing," Kyle said, his voice carrying a mix of awe and contentment. Douglas nodded, taking in the sight of his son, who had grown so much since that flight. "It was," he agreed, "and it feels like we're just getting started." Kyle turned to him, a smile breaking across his face. "Yeah, it does." Marcus approached, his presence still and grounding. "You both did good work here tonight," he said, his voice low but full of meaning. Douglas met Marcus's eyes and nodded, the respect mutual. "We couldn't have done it without the lesson you taught us," he said. "It started with you." Marcus smiled, a rare, wide smile that spoke of understanding and appreciation. "It started with all of us," he said, "and it will keep going." The night wrapped up with laughter, farewells, and promises to meet again. Marcus stayed a little longer, talking with Douglas and Kyle, sharing stories and ideas. It felt like a reunion and a planning session for the future all at once. As they parted ways, Douglas felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been unexpected and challenging, but it had brought them to a place of real understanding. It had shown him that strength lay not in clinging to the past, but in embracing the unknown, learning from others, and choosing to be better. As he walked home with Kyle, their steps echoed in sync, the city lights guiding them forward. It was a night that marked more than just an event. It marked the start of a journey that wouldn't end with a single flight or a single conversation, but would continue with each choice, each moment, and each act of kindness that followed. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the flight of shadows and honor. If you enjoyed the story and its themes of growth, courage, and the power of change, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who could use a little inspiration today. And remember, for more stories and content that touch the heart and make you think, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update.